So Liz is asking here, she says, if you've had severe Candida for 40 years, can your gut still heal? Is it even possible? Of course it is. Absolutely it's possible. And you have to start, the number one, I can't emphasize this enough, the number one component for all healing starts in your mind with this word right here, hope. If you don't have hope, by definition, you are hopeless. And when you're hopeless, there is no hope. And without hope, you're not going to heal. So understand that Liz, healing is possible. It doesn't matter how long you've been sick. Healing is possible. Your body has the power, it has the intelligence, it has the strength within it. You just have to remove the triggers, you have to remove the factors, you have to remove the things that are contributing to that chronic illness. And that part of that is your education. So know that there is hope to heal, even if you've been chronically sick for as long as 40 years. Oh, I love this question. Doris says, what does leaky gut have to do with Crohn's, and what is your take on Humira? So Crohn's is an autoimmune disease. It's an inflammatory autoimmune disease of the large intestine. And, Crohn's causes leaky gut. The inflammatory damage that's there rips holes in the gut lining. So, this goes back to which came first, the chicken or the egg. Did the Crohn's create the leaky gut, or did the leaky gut damage for so long lead to the inflammatory response that led to a Crohn's-like appearance when you had your scope done? And nobody can really answer that question. What's important to understand is that it's chicken and egg. You have to address the leaky gut, and you also have to address the inflammation at the same time. Now, part two of that question was, what about Humira? What's my opinion on Humira? My take on disease-modifying anti-rheumatic drugs as well as immune suppressants or biologics is that you should not take them unless you want to have cancer. Now, if you want to have a future with cancer in it, these drugs work really, really well at that outcome. So I don't recommend them unless your life is in such jeopardy that you're in the hospital and you're bleeding so much out of your intestine that if you don't take the biologic or you don't take those types of immune suppressing medications, that you'll bleed to death. So you would use it for stability, for control of the inflammation, but you would also want to make sure that you're addressing the food triggers and the medication triggers and the pesticide triggers and the plastics and the chemicals in your food triggers. Like, all those things become very, very important. Again, if we can get back that picture of the 9 triggers for leaky gut on the screen where you can really look at what those triggers are, because if you're suffering with Crohn's and you haven't looked at those triggers, then you should get your doctor immediately in and on board with measuring for those things. And if your doctor doesn't want to do that, and a lot of times they don't, then it's time to get another doctor to work with you on identifying what those triggers are so that you can empower yourself to make that change. I love this. Louise is saying, will I please visit Australia? I've got quite a few people from Australia who actually come to visit me. You know what? If you would put the seminar together and promise a couple of hundred people would be there, I would be happy to come to Australia. My wife might even want to come with me and do a talk on the topic, but I don't have the resources at this time to put something like that together. But if you're willing to do that for us, then we'll oblige by showing up and taking care of it. You just have to get with us. Get with my assistant, Sally. You can send an email to sally@glutenology@gmail.com, and if it's something that you want to do or take on, we're happy to accommodate you. So the question from Chris is, I don't understand the mechanism of food allergies if you eat them repetitively. Can you explain again? It's more or less what happens is when you have a leaky gut, Chris, and you're eating the same foods repetitively, those food proteins are leaking across the barrier. Remember, what's behind the barrier is the GALT, the gastro-associated lymphoid tissue. So you've got food proteins that are leaking into your immune system. And understand this, food proteins are supposed to be properly vetted by your GI cells. So these cells are supposed to properly vet those food amino acids and proteins as they're coming in. And if they're leaking through without being properly vetted, sometimes they're tagged by the immune system as foreign. They look foreign to the immune system because, again, they're not being properly vetted. So what happens is initially the GALT starts to attack those food proteins, and that's what we call the beginnings of an allergy, is where this gastro-associated lymphoid tissue starts to mount an immune response to proteins that are leaking through. The same thing can happen when we have bacterial proteins like endotoxins. They can leak through and they can create an immune response. And so we actually become hyperimmune. Our immune system becomes hyper responsive, or that's what autoimmune disease is it becomes so over responsive. And now, as long as you've got holes in the gut, as long as you're eating consistently, you're going to have the higher propensity to develop more and more reactions to more and more of the food that you're eating more and more often. So that's why it's important to seal the gut, to seal the lining of the GI tract, to reduce this kind of chronic battle with food. So many people are out there that struggle. They've restricted and restricted and restricted and restricted their diet multiple times, following different programs or protocols, but never really address the fundamental triggers for leaky gut. And until you address the fundamental triggers, it's not going anywhere. It'll just keep recreating, and the foods will just change, and the reactions to the foods will just change. So hopefully that's helpful for you. So Mark is asking, this is a good question. I've had Candida, heavy metals, Lyme, and Epstein-Barr. Is it best to go after heavy metals first, since Candida holds heavy metals as well? Not in my experience, Mark. It's in my experience, and I know a lot of people, there's a lot of doctors that might disagree with me, but frankly, I've got 18 years of clinical experience, and I've seen this repetitively over and over and over again. So, every doctor is going to have a different take on this. My experience is that it's better to actually go after yeast first. Yeast steal methyl groups, and one of the problems when your body is being robbed of methyl groups, methyl is part of how you detox heavy metals. So if you've got yeast that are using up all of your methyl groups, stealing all of your methyl groups, and any of you who've ever had genetic testing done for MTHFR and MTR and MTRR, different genes responsible for methylation, and you have mutations in these genes, you're the individuals that are going to really, really struggle if you've got a yeast overgrowth, because your methyl groups are being stolen, so you're not detoxifying very well. And remember, how do we detoxify heavy metals? We need methyl groups to do that. So if you don't, and that's why yeast is really, in my opinion, one of the easier things to get rid of. Heavy metals take a lot longer. It can take 2 years to really get rid of heavy metals. And if you've got a yeast overgrowth, you don't want to wait 2 years dealing with a heavy metal issue before you've dealt with a yeast issue. So in my experience, as well as in my opinion, it's always better to get rid of yeast before breaching or trying to go after metal. Okay, what are my thoughts on lectins in food? Lectins exist in a lot of different foods, and they can be, for many people, lectins can be digestive disruptive. They can be immune stimulating, and so if you've got chronic autoimmune disease, lectins can also be a problem. Where we tend to find a lot more lectins, or heavier quantities of lectins, are in the skins of things. So for example, the cucumber has got lectin in it, but a lot of those lectins are in the skin of the cucumber. That's why some people will shave that skin off, and it will reduce the symptomatic response they might have to eating that cucumber. But lectins can be a problem, and they're not a problem for everyone, but they can certainly be a problem for somebody whose gastrointestinal tract is compromised with intestinal permeability. So yeah, good question. So this one's a good one. Mark's chiming in saying, thank you. My biggest issue is I have to see my chiro 6 days a week. Reason is he has to pull my stomach down, always adjust valves as I have horrible chest pains and trouble breathing. Yeah, I mean, testing for H. pylori would be a great idea if that's what's going on. I mean, Mark, the other thing is you can have a physical problem. Remember, there's all these triggers that we're talking about today, these 9 triggers are predominantly biochemical triggers. They're chemical triggers, things that come in your body that alter your chemistry that can affect your GI lining. But you can have a physical valve problem, and sometimes a chiropractic adjustment is a great way. The problem with just doing a chiropractic adjustment is if you're addressing a physical valve issue because the valve is physically inflamed and broken, but you're not addressing the chemical triggers as to why that valve might be broken, then you're going to be at your chiropractor 6 times a week instead of maybe once a month, or far less frequently, because you're addressing the inflammatory chemical triggers that are creating the physical disruption of the actual valve itself. So it's important to have, if you've got a great chiropractor, Mark, have that conversation with him, because he may have some training in functional medicine, or she, And that may be your ability at that point to open up a bigger and broader conversation about how you can look for some of these other triggers. Cheryl's asking, where are these tests obtained? They're obtained, look, you've got to go to a smart and capable, well-trained functional medicine doctor. That's how they're obtained. Because there are a lot of tests out there. My advice is don't go it on your own. This is not an arena where you have the DIY mentality, where you have the do-it-yourself mentality. This isn't like go to Home Depot and build a deck in your backyard. This is your body. This is your health. You want to work with an expert who understands these things, because you can rack up a pretty big bill running lab tests. And a lot of times, and people come to me all the time with multiple labs. They've had this lab and that lab, and they were the wrong labs. They weren't the right labs. They weren't the right methodologies, or they were misleading, or the labs weren't done appropriately where they were being looked at comprehensively. So, my advice is to get with somebody who's trained in functional medicine who can really help you. Somebody's asking, is it possible to test for glyphosate in the body? If so, is it possible to detox from it, and how? Yes, it's possible to test for glyphosate in the body, and yes, it's possible to detoxify from it. One of the better ways to detoxify is you can use different forms of zeolites. Zeolites are compounds found in the Earth's crust with a very high surface area that have great binding potential. Using silicate binders can be effective. Using pectin binders can be effective for detoxification. But the number one way to detoxify is to love your body. And I know it sounds a little ridiculous, but no, I mean that. Love yourself first, and that don't put things in that burden its capacity to detoxify in the first place. Your body is a detoxifying machine. Where people get into trouble is they overload those systems. They overload the liver, they overload the kidneys, they overload the skin, they overload the internal organs, they overload the bile and the bile production. And so there's so much toxin coming in, there's not enough room, there's no capacity for detoxification. If you clean out the easy to clean out areas, if you clean up the diet, if you clean up the lifestyle, the body will detox on its own volition if you take away the poison and remove the interference. So many people do detoxification programs and don't remove the toxins. Like they do a 4-week detox and they don't remove the toxins. It's not going to help you. You're going to waste your money and you're not going to feel any better doing something like that. Okay, let's see here. Sally, if you have a gene that you don't detox well, what can I do? That's the question. So it's not that you have a gene that doesn't detox well, it's that you have a gene that might not be as good at detoxifying, but it still detoxes. What you do and what you can do is, again, check to see what are toxins for your body. In other words, have a good functional medicine doctor measure food allergies, chemical sensitivities, those types of things, because those are the things you can control, right? Those of you who have read No Grain, No Pain know these rules really well, but I'm going to reiterate them. Rule number 1, you can't get healthy eating food that's not healthy. Rule number 2, don't eat what you're allergic to. And rule number 3, if you feel bad when you eat it, stop eating it. Listen to your body as it tries to talk to you, right? Beyond that, you need to get testing done to try to discern what else could be potentiating the problem. And that's where a lot of people lack that knowledge. Is there's something called a delayed hypersensitivity response, where you can eat a food and you can have an inflammatory response 2 to 3 weeks after you eat it. So it's not something you feel immediately, so you never recognize what you're actually doing as being a part of the problem. And it's important to get that type of testing done so you can make the adjustment. So Melanie, I am addicted to sugar and flour. Please help. I have hypothyroidism due to a thyroidectomy. Melanie, best advice I can give you is get with a doctor and work through this. If you've had a thyroidectomy, you need guidance. You need medical guidance. You need functional medicine guidance. And if you're addicted to food, that needs to be explored a little bit deeper. That's more than what we can really handle in a Facebook or YouTube live session. Okay, let's see. I don't like to comment about particular lab tests. Several of you are asking me about a particular lab company and lab test. And I don't like to comment, especially if my commentary is not positive. I'd rather just not say anything. As the old adage goes, if there's nothing good to say, then don't say anything. Will insurance pay for it? Probably not. Insurance is one of those areas where you should really, in my opinion on insurance, is fire your insurance company and save your money and spend it on high quality food and high quality lifestyle behaviors. and you won't have the need for that insurance. So removing metal fillings, I like this question because it does. Mercury fillings can pertain to leaky gut. What do I think about it? I think before you remove mercury amalgams, you need to test yourself for mercury toxicity and see whether mercury is even a problem. Sometimes the mercury fillings can be, the silver amalgams can be the most stable of amalgams, and they're not always leaching or always breaking down. But test for mercury toxicity doing what's called a pre and post provocation test first. And that way you can see whether or not you need to prioritize getting those fillings out. And if you're going to do that, I will get with an environmental dentist. You can go to IAOMT.org and you can find specific dentists who are trained in environmental dentistry, where they're going to be a little bit well versed in how to properly remove a silver amalgam without contaminating you with more mercury. Louise is asking, is being lactose intolerant a good sign of gluten intolerance? No. Lactose and gluten are not the same thing. Lactose is a sugar, gluten is a protein. Lactose, understand what intolerance means. Intolerance means when you eat something, you cannot digest it. Whereas a gluten sensitivity is deeper than that. It's an immune response. It's also, in a sense, it's a digestive damage response. So the definitions are subtly different. I have a great video on the topic of sensitivity versus allergy versus intolerance that you might want to watch, Louise. If you go to glutenfreesociety.org, at the top of the page, there's a video called Gluten, What Is It? And I dive into the differences between intolerance and sensitivity, etc. It might be really helpful for you to understand that. And we may be getting that pinned up here just shortly for those of you in the feed who want to know more about it. So Rebecca's asking, will zeolite or clay, etc., leak through the gut wall and therefore causing issues instead of helping? It can. Look, it's not. This is why I don't recommend just take this generic detoxifying binding agent just because. Like, this is where if you're working with somebody who understands the ins and outs of leaky gut and the symptoms that are associated with trying to repair and restore gut permeability or gut barrier function, you can avoid doing things that aren't necessary and make the decisions to do the things that are absolutely right. One of my favorite things beyond, so we're talking about detoxification. If you want to know what my #1 weapon against detoxification is, and taking it won't hurt you at all, unlike some other kinds of supplements, you can take them and sometimes they can hurt you and not help you. It's a supplemental called Immune Shield. And what Immune Shield is it's concentrated antibodies. It's basically, it helps support this right here. And what these antibodies are designed to do, and they've been shown in study after study to help seal leaky gut, to help seal the barrier, if you've got bacteria, yeast overgrowth, to bind to the toxins that those bacteria and yeast can produce and help you flush them out. And if you take it and you don't have those problems, it doesn't hurt you. It's a source of protein that you can digest and absorb and use as protein. So very safe to take, but can be one of the most effective tools or weapons in the battle against leaky gut, especially if you've got ongoing currents of bacteria, yeast overgrowth, or other types of microorganisms that are pathological living in your gut. Does yogurt culture help heal your gut in my opinion? Look, they can. The problem with yogurt cultures depends on this. So we all talk about, like, if we're talking about eating certain types of animals, like eating beef or eating fish or chicken, we always talk about what they're being fed, right? Like, what do we feed the cow? We don't want to eat grain-fed cow meat because the omega-6 concentration of that meat is so high it can contribute to inflammation. So that's one of the reasons why we buy grass-fed beef. Well, what are you feeding your bacteria? In a lot of these dairy-based cultures, the food for the bacteria is a form of sugar. And so it depends on the dairy that's being used, because there are different qualities of dairy. If, for example, there's A1 milk and there's A2 milk. Another example would be there's some milks that are processed and highly pasteurized, and so you're adding into a culture, you're basically feeding bacteria milk that isn't good enough for you to eat or for you to drink. So why would you try to create fermented food out of it? So it depends, a lot of it depends on the source of where the dairy is coming from, but it also depends on whether or not you're allergic to dairy. Again, going back to measuring food, because there are people that, I've seen heal leaky gut as a result of eating very densely rich probiotic-based dairy products like kefir. And there are people that are allergic to dairy that if they try to do that, it's going to wreck them. So it's not, I'm sorry, it's just not as simple of an answer as a yes or a no. And this is where you want to have the right testing done to determine whether that's a good move for you. Good question, Peg. How long does it take to heal a leaky gut? It depends. It depends on how many causes there are. It depends on the compliance of the person trying to heal it. If they're cheating on their diet every day, it's obviously not going to heal as quickly. It depends on what's causing it. If there's an aggressive infection, like a very aggressive Klebsiella or Pseudomonas, and it's not as responsive to certain agents that you're trying to potentially treat it with, then it may take longer. It varies from person to person. There is no 2 weeks or 3 weeks answer. It varies from person to person depending on what the triggers are and how compliant the person is at trying and making the attempt to get rid of the triggers. It also depends on how sick the person is, because generally the more compromised and the more sick someone is, the longer it takes for them to recover and come back from that illness. So think of it like this. The average person with an autoimmune illness takes 18 months to 3 years to recover. Now that's to recover. That's not to feel somewhat better or slightly better. That's to recover. So if you're trying to figure out how long does leaky gut take, generally in my experience, most people get around getting their gut fixed in the first 6 months. And if you're not getting it done in that time frame that quickly, then you're probably missing a potential key element as to why it's there in the first place. Oh man, this is a time bomb question here. If a child was not breastfed and only fed on carnation milk powder for the first year of life, I feel sorry for that child. Would that damage its gut development and cause all of these issues? Leaky gut, lactose intolerance. It certainly wouldn't help. But again, we can't have a fatalistic attitude. This has got to come first, hope. So we don't, just because the first year of life the gut may have been damaged by the wrong type of food doesn't mean that this child can't come back and make a recovery. So keep that first and foremost. Don't dwell on what was done in the past. Dwell on what can be done in the future to improve the health. That's the best lesson I can say about that, because so many people stay sick because they develop a sense of hopelessness and they don't want to make the changes that are necessary to get better. Let's see here. Would you recommend taking Immune Shield indefinitely? You can. There's no harm in doing it, but it's not necessarily necessary to take indefinitely. So I mean, to answer that question, it depends on the person. Again, you can take it and it won't hurt you, but you may not need to take it indefinitely. I mean, if you're doing all the other right things, you shouldn't need to take it indefinitely. Okay, I'm glad this question's coming up. Natasha's asking, how does Epstein-Barr in the past, antibodies to Epstein-Barr, contribute or potentially create this problem? In my experience in 18, and I've been doing this for about 18 years, I've seen a lot of people come in that thought they had Epstein-Barr virus, and they had antibody titers to Epstein-Barr, but Epstein-Barr never needed to be treated. It never needed to be addressed. It really was one of those guilt by association issues where they had the antibodies, but the antibodies weren't necessarily any part of their problem. So if you've got Epstein-Barr virus antibodies, it doesn't necessarily mean you have Epstein-Barr and that Epstein-Barr is creating the issue. That's just, again, that's my experience. I've seen maybe 2 cases where Epstein-Barr was truly at part of the root origin for why a person was staying chronically ill. And about 65 to 70% of the adult population in the United States would test positive for Epstein-Barr. So when you see those Epstein-Barr antibody tests come back positive, don't just jump into that as the sole reason as to why your problem might exist. You have to interpret that type of result with a little bit of caution. Rebecca, I've heard leaky gut will never heal if you have adrenal and stress problems. Your thoughts? Depends on how bad the adrenal and stress problems are. I mean, understand that if you're under chronic stress, it's one of the fastest and easiest ways to shut down the healing process is to overproduce cortisol. And that's what happens when you're under chronic stress. And cortisol is a corticosteroid. So what did I say earlier about steroids creating leaky gut? You can make your own steroid that can contribute to a pre-existing leaky gut from healing. So the answer is yes, chronic stress can do that. So part of this pathway is if you're under chronic stress, you've got to identify where that stress is coming from. So whether it's physical stress or emotional stress or whether it's biochemical stress from foods or infections, that all has to be looked at, it all has to be addressed. Okay. All right. Man, I can't see more questions in the feed, but let's see. I don't want to ignore my other feed here, so let me check that out too. Do I recommend digestive enzymes when repairing your gut, or should you always take them? With digestive enzymes, what I recommend is not just taking digestive enzymes for the sake of taking digestive enzymes, although there's no harm really in doing it. Like, so it's another one of those supplements like Immune Shield that you can take. It won't create harm unless you're allergic to one of the ingredients that you haven't tested for. But it won't. Generally, they don't create harm, and they can be helpful to aid in digestion and take stress and pressure off the gut. But there are some tests that can be done that can measure your own body's ability to produce its digestive enzymes, and that's what I would really recommend before just taking digestive enzymes indefinitely. Is actually test to see whether or not you have digestive enzyme deficiency. Because if you don't, you might just be having an expensive supplement that may not be 100% necessary. So again, depends on the person. Let's see here. Can my wife who's nursing our child get her mercury amalgams removed? As long as she's nursing, look, I'm not a dentist, full disclosure, but as long as she's nursing, I wouldn't run that risk. I'd wait till the nursing part was done, and that way we can minimize any, if they do it wrong or if they mess up or if the mercury spills over and gets into the bloodstream more aggressively, can show up in the breast milk. I would do that after breastfeeding is done. Okay. Let's see here. What is, well, we're not, okay. Let's see here. So what is your typical protocol for Candida? Understanding we're all different, but a general idea. So, again, I'm going to give you a very generalized protocol, and I'm going to mention or reference certain products because I've got great familiarity with them. So, generally speaking, for Candida, we've got to take a high quality source of probiotic, and generally you want 100 billion or more, 100 billion colony forming units of probiotic. Probiotic defense, which is about 400 billion colony forming units a day. It's a powder you mix with water. There's also another one for yeast in particular. It's a probiotic with a mixture of something called Saccharomyces boulardii, which is a type of probiotic mixture that helps suppress the growth of yeast. So it helps kind of combat the yeast overgrowth within the GI tract. So that's another good option to have with a probiotic. So you need that as a bare minimum. So you definitely want to have a probiotic. And then, there are a number of different botanicals, herbs, and other compounds or chemicals that have an antifungal effect. This is where everybody's a little different because some yeast are sensitive. For example, when I look at yeast overgrowth and people that come to see me, one of the things that we're doing is a sensitivity test. We're measuring for yeast, and if we find it, we're seeing what will kill their yeast best. So sometimes oregano is commonly used as an example as a plant to kill off yeast overgrowth, but a lot of people have yeast overgrowths that are oregano resistant, so the oregano doesn't really work. So this is where you can use things like oregano and caprylic acid and uva ursi. And there are a number of plant botanicals, even silver, like homeopathic silver can be pretty effective. Berberine can be pretty effective. Grapefruit seed extract can be pretty effective. So again, there are a lot of different types of plants and herbals that can be decently effective for yeast overgrowth, but it always will vary based on the person's yeast, because that is where we might see a resistance. So I would say, and the one product that I have that's very broad spectrum, so if you aren't sure how to kill your yeast, this one has a lot of different things that might have a greater effect, kind of a greater umbrella effect. It's called Yeast Shield, and it's very effective. And you can take up to 4 of those a day in an unsupervised way to kind of help with a yeast protocol. And one of the other things on a yeast protocol is you have to change your diet. A lot of people will do the supplements, but they won't change their diet. You've got to combine diet with the supplemental change. So you can't just do the supplements and not change your diet, because as you're trying to kill yeast and you're trying to suppress their growth, if you're feeding them sugar every day, if you're feeding them things that will help them to not die, basically to continue to support their growth, then you're going to be unsuccessful. And alcohol is absolutely a big no-no when you have a yeast overgrowth. It's one of the quickest and easiest ways to maintain that yeast overgrowth, as is taking antibiotics. Antibiotics are probably one of the top or leading causes of yeast overgrowth in people that I see. Okay, let's see here. A lot of questions about SIBO. What is the root cause and how to prevent it? The best way to, the root cause of SIBO is it's an overgrowth of small intestinal bacteria, hence the name SIBO, SIBO, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. In my experience, SIBO issues will typically go away when you identify and isolate this component. This is number one priority. You can take all the botanicals in the world, all the berberine in the world, but if you're not looking at how food is affecting the gut and food is affecting the microbiome, then you're gonna miss the boat on SIBO if you're just trying to use, like some doctors will prescribe rifaximin, which is an antibiotic. Natural practitioners will oftentimes recommend berberine in higher doses, which is a natural antibiotic, plant-based compound. And again, without diet change, I very rarely see SIBO go away meaningfully. I like this question. Does leaky gut come after Candida, or is Candida a result of leaky gut? It's rhetorical, chicken or the egg. It doesn't matter. If you've got both, you have to address both. If you've got one, you have to address the one. So the answer is both, in that leaky gut can compromise the immune system well enough to allow for a yeast overgrowth, and vice versa. A yeast overgrowth can actually secrete, the yeast can secrete endotoxins that can damage the gut wall that can create a leaky gut. So it's both. All right, I think I've got them all answered. Yeah, we're running over, so we'll have to catch it. So again, if you guys want to tune in and learn more, make sure you're subscribing to the feed. You can subscribe if you're watching on Facebook. You can subscribe. Make sure you click the gear button so that you get notified. Every Monday night is when we like to do these events. Sometimes it changes, so if you hit the gear button and get notified of when we're going live, you'll always have that early notice so that you can plan your calendar accordingly. Make sure you also subscribe to our YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/glutenology. And again, if you haven't already, go over to glutenfreesociety.org, sign up for our free gluten-free survival kit. It's just a lot of wonderful information that can help you start changing your diet in a meaningful way that can move the needle in your health. And if you don't have your copy yet of No Grain, No Pain, make sure you pick that up. And if you pick it up, send us your receipt. If you go to nograinnopaybook.com and send us your receipt on that website, we'll send you a lot of free gifts. One of them is all about leaky gut. We've got an entire 70-page manual on how to overcome leaky gut. So we will see you next week. If you've got topic ideas that you'd like to see us cover in the future, make sure you email us, glutenology@gmail.com. We're happy to entertain your topic requests and ideas. Have a great week. We'll see you next time. Hey, if you've got a functional medicine or health question that you'd like me to answer for you, make sure you send me an email, glutenology@gmail.com, and we'll do our best to create a video answer just for you. Have a great day.